This is where we find out if I broke the mic when I dropped it. All right. So welcome. This is an adventure for us at Rutland Free Library. This is our first afternoon programming for people over the age of 6 in about 30 years. So welcome. Nice to see a good turnout this afternoon. My name is Randall Smathers, and on behalf of the library, I'd like to welcome you to our Snapshot event in partnership with Vermont Humanities, 50 years that transformed Vermont, with journalist Chris Graff. And I really think that gives Chris a short shrift. It's what I'm supposed to say, but as a Canadian hockey player and former journalist, I have to say I'm a little bit in awe that I am introducing Chris. Not as much as the time I saw Gordie Howe sitting at the next table in a rib joint in Edmonton eating ribs, but right up there. And you folks all listened to Chris broadcast. You've seen him broadcast. You've read his stuff for years and years, which is why you're here this afternoon. So I am pretty pumped about this. Snapshot is Vermont Humanities' weekly live stream program that hosts a variety of speakers at public libraries each year, and we are delighted to be participants. We extend our thanks to our partners at Vermont Humanities, as well as to the generous underwriters who make it possible for us to offer such rich and robust programming. The sponsor of our entire Snapshot season is the Vermont Department of Libraries, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and the Alma Gibbs Donchian Foundation. And the sponsor of all programming we do in Rutland Free Library is our fabulous Friends group. So today, before we come together from across the state to listen, learn, and be inspired in community, today we do that. Before we begin, I have a few brief housekeeping items from Vermont Humanities. Next Snapshot event is on December 11th at 7 p.m., hosted by the St. Johnsbury Athenaeum, and it is Paranoia in the Hills, Cold War Vermont as Inspiration for Crime Fiction, with author Sarah Stewart Taylor. I have started a small series, speaker series here in the library. Our next event for that is March 26th. It is Cold Case Files, the East Middlebury Murders of 1935, which I am totally excited about. For true crime aficionados, it's pretty spectacular. There was a woman and 2 children found murdered execution style and left wrapped up in a store awning and dumped in the woods. And things have changed a little bit since 1935. They had to post a sheriff's deputy at the scene because people were showing up with scissors to cut off pieces of the awning to have as a souvenir. So that'll be a lot of fun. And then April, date and time to be determined. My good friend Lucia Suarez Sang, who I hired at the Rutland Herald, fabulous hire by the way, is going to be talking about how Subaru became the official car of lesbians first, and then of Vermont. So look for that coming in April. And with that, it is now my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker. Chris Graff is the author of Dateline Vermont, which chronicles Vermont's political history from the 1960s through the 2000s. He worked for the Associated Press, led the Associated Press for most of it, for 28 years and hosted Vermont Public Television's Vermont This Week from 1992 through 2006. He has interviewed 9 former Vermont governors for the public television series The Governors, telling the story of Vermont from 1959 through 2011. And please welcome him to Rutland Free Library this afternoon.
What a nice welcome. Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming out on a day in which there's a storm forecast. So 2 o'clock in the afternoon probably turned out to be a good time, Randall, because if you had said 4 or 6, everyone would have stayed home. Every time I come to Rutland, I can't help but think of Gilly Godnick, former mayor, former state senator, and one of the most colorful characters in the Vermont State House. He was sort of Vermont's version of Yogi Berra, with the mangling of the English language, saying things like, "You 3 make quite a pair. We'll burn that bridge when we get to it. And there's always one rotten egg in every bushel of apples." So we're here today to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Vermont Humanities. It was January of 1974 when Victor Swenson, the council's first executive director, moved a picnic table and folding chair into an empty office in Hyde Park and kickstarted a rich conversation about history, religion, arts, and music, and a conversation that continues today. And I don't know if some of you know, but this library played a big role in that story as well. There was a woman named Pat Bates, who was the program director here at the library 35 years ago. And she wanted to start a women's discussion group, a book discussion group. And it was so incredibly successful that Victor Swenson, the executive director of Vermont Humanities Council, asked her to replicate it around the state, and eventually it went national. And that was the genesis for what is now the Vermont Reads program, that is also one of the most popular things that Vermont Humanities has done. So much has happened since the Vermont Humanities Council was formed 50 years ago. So much has happened here in Vermont. We have elected our first Democratic senator, our first and only woman governor, our first ever Democratic majorities in the Vermont House and Senate, our first Democratic Speaker of the House, our first Democratic President pro tem of the Senate. We enacted civil unions. We enacted same-sex marriage. 50 years ago, it was illegal to sell anything other than essential goods in Vermont on a Sunday. The so-called blue laws would remain in effect till 1981. There were no malls in Vermont 50 years ago. The years-long debate over the Pyramid Mall in Williston was still years away. Ben and Jerry's didn't exist 50 years ago. Bernie was a fringe candidate. Jim Jeffords was still very much a Republican. In 1974, by the way, he had been Attorney General. He just lost a race for governor, and this year, 1974, he was running for the U.S. House, and he won that seat. The Vermont Yankee nuclear power plant was just 2 years old and had been heralded as generating electricity too cheap to meter. Act 250 was 4 years old. Act 200 was more than a decade away. The Brandon Training School was still open, or as it was known in its history, the Vermont State School for Feeble-Minded Children. The century-old Week School was still in business in Vergennes, 5 years away from being closed following criticism of rampant abuse and neglect of children. Nationally, Richard Nixon was president. In January of '74, he had just been subpoenaed asked to surrender the 500 tapes that had been subpoenaed by the Senate Watergate Committee. A gallon of milk cost $1.39, bacon was 99 cents, and eggs were 58 cents a dozen. Post-it notes were invented in 1974. Jaws by Peter Benchley was published, the book version, and The $6 Million Man with Lee Majors premiered on ABC. By the way, 50 years ago, I was writing a political column for the Valley Voice, a weekly in Addison County. A year later, I would go to work for the commercial radio station in Middlebury, WFAD, as its first news director, earning $120 a week. It's my belief that no other state has changed as much as Vermont has in these 50 years. In 1974, Vermont's national political image was that of Silent Cal. Its literature was that of Robert Frost. And its music was represented by Moonlight in Vermont. Today, its political image is that of Bernie. Its literature is that of Julia Alvarez. Its music is represented by Phish, Grace Potter, and now by Noah Kahan. But I believe the most significant change in the last 50 years is the state's political swing from the most Republican state in the nation to the most Democratic. Few people today know or remember that for a century, from the 1850s to the 1950s, Vermont was the most Republican state in the nation. More about that in a minute. The second change is just as significant, although it's a bit harder to define. Vermont is closer to the world today than it ever has been. We are still small, we're still rural, but we're no longer completely divorced from the rest of the country. We're no longer at the end of the pipeline. The interstates brought Vermont closer. The internet has completed that change. Let me start first with the political change, the swing from red to blue. If somebody had told me 50 years ago that Bernie, that gadfly of the Liberty Union at the time, who got 2% of the tally in his run for the US Senate in 1972, would someday become a member of that exclusive club, I would have dismissed them out of hand. And if someone had told me that indeed he would almost win the Democratic presidential nomination, not once but twice, I would have absolutely decided that they needed help somewhere. At the time, 1974, Vermont was still solidly Republican. And for 100 years, Vermont had been the most Republican state in the nation. The election of Stephen Royce as a Whig Republican in 1854, and then his re-election in 1855 as a Republican, marked the beginning of unbroken rule for 1 century by the Republicans. Some years in that century found Vermont pretty much alone in its support of Republicans. In 1912, only Vermont and Utah supported the presidential bid of William Howard Taft. In 1936, Vermont and Maine were the only states to vote against Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The bond between Vermont and the Republican Party made a lot of sense at the time. It was formed out of a dislike for slavery and a belief in the sanctity of the Union of States. Vermonters stood firmly behind the party of Abraham Lincoln. And over the years, that commitment, cemented by the Civil War, was strengthened by a belief that the Republican philosophy meshed well with small-town rural life. Another strong factor in that century of unbroken rule was, believe it or not, a Republican machine that operated in Vermont. It was actually located pretty close to where we're sitting right now. It was organized to win elections, and it started in the 1870s. The Proctor family ran the political machine. They assumed a leadership role that allowed the family to run the state pretty much for 80 years. Redfield Proctor, who was the founder of the Vermont Marble Company, was elected in 1878. His son Fletcher in 1906, Redfield Jr. in 1922, and Fletcher's son Mortimer in 1945. In between, most of the governors were Proctor-chosen candidates from the allied worlds of industry, utilities, railroad, and insurance. In that period, politics were so predictable in Vermont. Politicians climbed a ladder, serving as Speaker of the House, Lieutenant Governor, and Governor in a predetermined rotation that for much of a century rotated between the western side of the state and the eastern side. So you had a governor that was from the western side of the state, followed by a governor from the eastern side of the state. But think about that for a minute. Because lieutenant governor always ascended to become governor in this rotation, it meant that you had to figure out your Speaker of the House for the western side of the state, your lieutenant governor from the eastern side of the state, your governor from the western side of the state. And you had to do this years in advance. And the Proctor family did it all. So as you can imagine, for much of this century, Vermont's leadership was pretty uninspiring. For much of the 20th century, Vermont was a backwater that was desperate for growth. The historian Paul Gillis likes to say that Vermonters never really realized that there was a Great Depression because it was so much like the life they had been living before and after the Great Depression. Vermont was not a place to escape to, it was a place to escape from. So what happened? What changed? Well, quite simply, the state changed. It was not one thing, but everything. The interstates put Vermont within easy reach. The ski areas and the heavy marketing of Vermont as the beckoning country enticed many. IBM opened a facility in Essex in 1956 that first employed 450, but eventually would employ 7,500. Many graduates from the state's growing colleges and universities simply stayed on after graduation. Quality of life was becoming increasingly important to people all across the country. And that was something that Vermont could offer. So the population figures tell the story. It took a century, from 1850 to 1950, for the population to grow 20%. Yet it grew 27% in the 20 years from 1970 to 1990. So think about that. When we dive down a little deeper and try to figure out, well, what caused the change both in the politics and in the demographics, there are really two things that, in my mind, make the difference. One was the interstates, and the other was reapportionment of the Vermont House. First, the interstates. On November 1st, 1958, the first section was completed. 6 miles of Interstate 91 from the Massachusetts border north. Eventually, 321 miles of interstate highway would transect the state, opening up Vermont for a new wave of immigrants. George Aiken said at the 1961 dedication of a section of Interstate 91 that was paving over his boyhood home. He said, "We're on the verge of the greatest development Vermont has ever seen." And that proved true. Look at the difference between Brattleboro and Bennington. Brattleboro has 3 exits off the interstate. Bennington has no interstate. Look at the difference in the development of those two communities. Here's something for you to consider here in Rutland. In the 1940s, the original plan by Vermont was to run the interstate up the western side of the state, Bennington to Rutland, Middlebury, Burlington. Instead, the politicians had much more clout in Connecticut and in Massachusetts, and so the interstate was going to run through Hartford and Springfield, so it entered Vermont at Brattleboro. But just think for a minute, what would Vermont be like? What would Rutland be like if, in fact, the interstate had come up the western side of the state instead of the eastern side of the state? By the way, that's why Phil Hoff, for many years, tried very, very hard to build this superhighway across west to east of Route 4, because he was trying to make up for the fact that the interstate did not come here. Reapportionment. Not many people know the story of reapportionment, so I'm going to spend a few minutes on it. Even though it happened in the 1960s, It's really important in understanding the swing of Vermont politics. From the very beginning, Vermont had a system of one town and one vote in the House. So in the 1960s, the representative from Stannard, which is a community tucked up in the Northeast Kingdom, at the time had a population of 113, had the same vote in the Vermont House as the representative from Burlington, who represented 35,000 people. It was a system that put the power in the hands of the small towns. Representatives of 12% of the population controlled a majority vote in the 246-member House of Representatives. In 1965, under order from federal judges, lawmakers created a plan to create what we now have, the 150-member House, based on population. When that happened, slowly the power began to move to the cities, away from the small towns. It was slow. In 1964, the last year the House existed as a 246-member House, reapportionment, Republicans had 195 seats and Democrats 50. In 1966, the first reapportioned House, Republicans had 115 seats, while Democrats had 35. It took 20 years, the 1986 election, for the Democrats to get a majority in the House, 76 to 74. By the way, the next year they went back, next election they went back and it was tied, 75-75. It took another decade after that, in the election of 1996, for Democrats to win control of the state Senate. That's not too long ago when you think about it. We think of Vermont as now this dominant Democrat state, the most liberal state in the nation, according to all the exit polls. But that's really pretty recent for those of us who actually have a longer perspective. You can chart the Republican slide. In 1974, Patrick Leahy was elected to the Senate, exactly 50 years ago right now, and became the first U.S. member of the Senate from a Democratic member. In 1975, Timothy O'Connor Brattleboro became the first Democratic Speaker of the Vermont House. The election of 1982 was the last in which the Republicans won all of the statewide offices and the legislature. By 1998, the Republicans only elected one statewide office holder, and that was Jim Douglas as state treasurer. So here we are today at the end of this 50-year period. I mentioned at the outset some of the firsts we've seen in this period, like the election of Pat Leahy, the end of the blue laws, the passage of same-sex marriage, and the launching of Ben & Jerry's. And there are literally thousands of other milestones, I bet, that we all can think of in this period. The rise of women in the labor force and as a political force happened within this 50-year period. The rise of special interests and lobbyists and money in the legislative process and in the political process in Vermont. When I first started covering the legislature in the 1975, there were basically 2 or 3 lobbyists. That was it. Now there's hundreds. Other events, the raid on Island Pond, the Supreme Court's 1997 Brigham decision on education financing. Just go down memory lane, and there's so many things that have happened in this time period. But when I look back at this half century, what stands out for me is the surge of development and the state's response to that development. There are a lot of ways to look at it to try to define what that development is. Back in 1974, the population of the state was roughly 440,000 people. Today, it is 647,000. So that's 200,000 additional people in those 50 years. Chittenden County has become the powerhouse of the state in these last 50 years. That is a pretty significant change. The population of Chittenden County has roughly doubled in the past 50 years. 1/4 of Vermonters live in Chittenden County. By the way, wasn't always that way. We're here in Rutland County, which until through the 1930s was the most populous county. It was in the 1940s that Chittenden County edged past Rutland County. Here's an interesting factoid to consider about Chittenden County's power. Not a single governor from 1900 to 1960 lived in Chittenden County. But 4 of the 7 governors who served from 61 to 2003 lived there at the time of their election. Every governor from 1977 to 2003 hailed from the Burlington area. The constant throughout this 50-year period is a never-ending battle between development and environmental protection. Tom Salmon, who was the governor in 1974, at the beginning of this 50-year period, by the way, not to just pick on Gilligod, because Tom Salmon gave us plenty of language to be concerned about. He was the one who told us that education is the 4th leg of the tripod of the state economy. But Tom Salmon won office in 1972 with a campaign built around an anti-development theme and a compelling catchphrase that was unequivocal: Vermont is not for sale. His campaign, by the way, 1972, was one of the most amazing campaigns ever run in Vermont. He did not declare his candidacy for governor until August of 1972. No one wanted to run against Dean Davis's hand-picked successor, Fred Hackett. Or actually, Jim Jeffords was still in that primary, but lost. But Tom Salmon went to the Democratic National Convention as a delegate for McGovern, and he came home so fired up about George McGovern that he said, by golly, I'm going to run for governor of Vermont. And everyone said, sure, Tom. And he won. He won that election. And he won primarily because he did say, Vermont is not for sale. And that was a chord that struck home with Vermonters. The Republican approach was best summed up at what has really become one of the most famous lines in Vermont politics, and it was someone from Rutland, Roland Seward. He was a top Republican leader, and he said at a speech in Springfield at the Springfield Rotary, what are we saving the environment for? The animals? What was most surprising about that remark and about the Republican nominee's sort of disinterest in saving the environment, he backed off. That was Fred Hackett. He backed off, for instance, from supporting the bottle ban, which had taken effect just about that time. Were that the incumbent governor, Dean Davis, was probably the most pro-environment governor of all times for Vermont. He had passed Act 250, Act 252. It was incredible what Dean Davis accomplished for the environment. And yet the Republicans sort of gave that up in the next election. I think when I think about the environmental protections and the fight with overdevelopment, it speaks volumes for me that Howard Dean, when he was stepping down after 11 years as governor, was asked what he was most proud of. This was the guy who had expanded dramatically health care for children. He'd overseen the creation of civil unions. He had enacted the most radical change in school financing ever seen in Vermont. And yet his choice when asked what he was most proud of was land conservation. What he said was, 100 years from now, we will have hunting, hiking, fishing, and snowmobile riding because of what he did, what we did. And he had plenty to brag about, including a massive deal to conserve 133,000 acres of recreation and timberland in the Northeast Kingdom. He definitely was on to something. More than 1 million acres of land has been conserved in Vermont, about 16% of the state, either as state or national forest or park or because of conservation easements. But throughout this 50-year period, we've seen governors grapple with this tension between economic development and environmental protection, really trying to find that point of how much development can we handle. It continues today. We've seen it every year in recent years. We have seen the governor and the legislature debate, how can we change Act 250? And it's a bitter, bitter fight to try to find that balance. So much has changed in the last 50 years, but there are some things that have not, and I am really struck by one of the things that remains constant. When we speak of Tom Salmon, he sticks out in my mind because his was the first inauguration that I actually attended. I was a college reporter, and I went to Montpelier, and it was a big deal for me to go to Montpelier to cover the inauguration. And I was walking up the street next to the Pavilion office building, and there was Tom Salmon walking down the street with a state police trooper next to him in plain clothes, just the two of them walking down the street. And what surprised me was there he was hours from becoming governor, and there was no entourage. There was no big security. It was just the governor. And yet that's unchanged over 50 years. You can see Phil Scott walking down the street with his trooper. Nobody else. You can see Phil Scott out riding his bike. We treat our politicians as us. Our politicians know how important it is that they remain and retain that. That's why we don't have a governor's mansion in Vermont. That's why governors, when there were phone books, listed their phone numbers of their home phones in the phone book. Ours really is a government of human scale, and that has been unchanged. And I think that we tend to take that for granted because we do expect it. And yet it is so unique to Vermont. It really is. When I look and think about why Howard Dean and Bernie Sanders were so successful as presidential candidates, and Bernie was twice, I think that they offered something that the nation hungers for. And yet, as I said, we take for granted. And it's quite simply being authentic. We expect our Vermont politicians to talk with us, not at us. We expect them to speak in English. We expect them to have regular conversations with us, whether it's in town hall forums on the street in grocery stores or on Vermont Public, whether it's on radio or TV. When Patrick Leahy was in the Senate, when he was president pro tem of the Senate, third in line to the presidency, he still would be at the Montpelier Farmers Market on a Saturday, walking around, grandchildren in tow, talking to everyone, and willing to talk to everyone. Howard Dean's presidential campaign took off when he asked a series of simple, pointed, and bold questions at a February 2003 meeting of the Democratic National Committee. What he said was, "What I want to know is why in the world the Democratic Party leadership is supporting the president's unilateral attack on Iraq. What I want to know is why are Democratic Party leaders supporting tax cuts? The question is not how big the tax cut should be. The question should be, can we afford a tax cut at all with the largest deficit in the history of this country?" It was like a moment from The Emperor's New Clothes, with Dean playing the part of the little boy who yells out, "Hey, the Emperor doesn't have any clothes." It was so shocking for someone to challenge what the Democratic Party leadership was espousing at that time. That's why Howard Dean's presidential campaign took off. His campaign would come to focus on two lines that he repeated 1,000,000 times. We're going to take our country back, and you have the power. That was 20 years ago. Think about that. Those themes also propelled Bernie Sanders to his near successes in 2016 and 2020. And it's what Bernie Sanders was saying on the campaign trail this year, nationally as he traveled. You have the power. It's what we think here in Vermont, and it's not what people expect. Another thing about Howard Dean's presidential campaign that always stuck with me was that he was running against all United States senators for the Democratic presidential nomination. Senators do not speak English. Senators speak filibuster. They can't answer a question directly. And yet Howard Dean did. And the press was blown away, and so was the public. They'd ask him a question, he'd go, yes. They'd ask him a question, he said, no. That, by the way, is exactly what George Aiken used to do, too. George Aiken appeared on You Can Quote Me, which was, some of you may still watch it, the WCAX interview program. At a time, it was broadcast on Sunday nights just before 60 Minutes, and it was the most watched television show in Vermont. And George Aiken would go on there, and they would have their questions lined up, and George Aiken would answer yes, no, and no more. I mean, they expected him to, they'd ask a question. They'd come in with 10 questions, and they were done with their 10 questions in 5 minutes. That's what we expect. We want direct people like that. Dean and Sanders are as different as can be in style and background, but they were both schooled in this political ways of Vermont, where our leaders are authentic, straight shooting, and aware of the problems facing everyday residents. I go back to another Howard Dean example. But other governors were this way. Jim Douglas was exactly this way, too. I used to host Call the Governor on Vermont Public Television, or at the time, Vermont ETV, for those of us older. And a call would come in, and the caller would say, you know, I'm upset about my road, da, 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 da. And instead of sort of blowing him off or something, Howard would say, well, where do you live in Randolph? Oh, are you past the Black House, or are you up the road? He wanted to show everybody that he knew everything, and he did. about Vermont. He knew all the people. Jim Douglas the same way. Jim Douglas has the most incredible memory. You could meet him at the Addison County Fair and see him 10 years later, and he would remember you. And he'd ask about your sister and see if she's still living in Newport. And that's pretty much what we expect in Vermont. We want our politicians to really be part of us, part of our community. When Jim Douglas ran for governor 2002, you remember Doug Racine and Con Hogan were the candidates that year. They had 36 forums. Unheard of. You know, nowadays, nationally, you're lucky if you get one debate among candidates. We expect to see a candidate for governor, especially when the office opens up, 2, 3, 4 times. We want to kick the tires. We want to know what they're like. And that's our expectations. We want them in a group this size. We don't want to see them at a rally with thousands of people. And that's what really makes things different. The other example I think of when I'm thinking about this authentic persona that is the Vermont politician in these last 20 years is Jim Jeffords, here from this area. His Declaration of Independence in 2001 just galvanized the nation. Majority Leader Trent Lott called it a coup of one and the impetus decision of one man to undermine our democracy. But all across America, Jeffords' decision to leave the Republican Party and give control of the Senate to the Democrats was seen as a refreshing and bold step, so unlike what was expected in Washington. Why was Jim Douglas President Obama's favorite governor? Because Douglas was willing to work with the White House. Why does Peter Welch command so much respect in Washington as a House member and now as a senator? Because he too is the Democrat considered most willing to seek out common ground with Republicans. These are not isolated examples. None of this is by example. To be successful in Vermont requires politicians to be authentic, approachable, pragmatic, and to exhibit common sense and straight talk. That's the Vermont way, and it's the way politics have been before and since 50 years ago. Thank you so much, and happy to take questions. Yep. Yes. Not in Vermont. So you've actually asked a great question that I'm going to take yes. Thank you, Randall. People are sitting at home. What's not in Vermont? Chunky Monkey ice cream is not available in Vermont. The question was, the recent election, does it indicate a swing back possible coming towards the Republicans in Vermont, towards the red state? Vermont will be blue and Democratic for as long as we can see. That doesn't mean that there aren't fluctuations. And here's the interesting thing about Vermont politics that sort of makes a little trouble with my theme about Vermont swinging from red to blue, being the most Democratic state in the nation. I'm surprised no one sort of said the question. You're probably thinking it. Well, what about Phil Scott? What about Jim Douglas? Huh? Well, I got an answer for you. Vermont is very blue. It's very democratic. It is the most liberal state. However, personality politics play a part in our governor's races. Not in our races for U.S. Senate and not for U.S. House. Why? Because the majority matters in Washington. We are not going to send a Republican in recent years to Washington, no matter how great they are, if it's going to allow the Republican agenda and the Republican speaker. We want Democrats in Washington. Governor is a whole different matter. And here's the most fascinating thing, and this stretches more than 50 years. It goes back to 1963. Every time the office of governor has opened in Vermont since 1963, we've changed parties. I don't know that there's another state in the nation where this is true. In 1962, Phil Hoff was elected governor. He replaced Dean Davis. Hoff, who I wish, sometimes we could spend a whole day talking about, is the most amazing governor Vermont has ever had. When Hoff decided to step down after 6 years, Vermonters were given a choice between his lieutenant governor and somebody entirely different. And they chose the different guy, Dean Davis, the conservative Republican insurance executive. When Davis stepped down, he was really, really popular. And Vermonters once again had a choice between a Davis-picked candidate, another insurance executive, or somebody entirely different, Tom Salmon, the Democrat. And they went with Salmon. And it goes throughout our entire 50 years. Salmon was followed by Snelling. Snelling was followed by Cunin. Cunin was followed by Snelling. And Snelling died. Howard Dean became governor. But people forget this. When Howard Dean first became governor, he was pretty darn conservative. More fiscally conservative than Dick Snelling even was. And then when Howard Dean finally gave up the office after a few dozen years, Jim Douglas was elected. After Douglas, we went to Peter Shumlin. After Shumlin, Scott. And I can predict today, because no one will remember that I said this, that the next governor will be a Democrat. And that's the way it is. And it's not just partisan balance. Vermonters have this great ability to know what the state needs at a time. So for instance, after Phil Hoff had been governor, the state was pretty much a fiscal wreck. Phil had brought in all this federal money, had done all of this stuff, built all these programs, did an incredible job. But the fiscal house was not in order. Dean Davis put it in order, and by the way, created the sales tax, imposed the sales tax to make that happen. Every time you look, and you can look at, pick out any of those governors. Dick Snelling, followed by Madeline Cunin, and then Madeline Cunin was followed again by Dick Snelling because he said it's time to get our fiscal house in order. So we're looking for balance. There's this really pretty incredible pendulum that swings, but we're pretty smart in knowing what the state needs at any time. Jim Douglas winning election is a case in point. Doug Racine was seen as a continuation of Howard Dean, and Jim Douglas, campaigned very hard. In that year, 2002, we were seeing a lot of job losses, starting with IBM, which was unheard of at the time. And his theme was Jim equals jobs. He said that time and time again. And Vermonters chose him over Doug Racine, who was very much Howard Dean's protege at the time. Other questions? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good point, and I addressed it a little bit slightly by saying graduates of our colleges and universities came up for the school and they stayed because they liked it. And if you look around where some of the communes were, they were graduates of Goddard College, they were graduates of Bennington College, and they just stayed on. But they're also, especially in the Northeast Kingdom, you saw a lot of young people moving up. That made a difference. It did. The demographics switched pretty dramatically, and the young people had a big part in that. Yes.
We have an online question. They would like to have you talk about John Rogers in this connection.
Talking about John Rogers in this connection. You know, I think when it comes to the office of lieutenant governor, you can't draw too much from it. It's hard to draw generalities from an election for lieutenant governor, especially when there's personalities involved. This is a very unique situation with John Rogers because he was a Democrat and then he ran as a Republican, so he knew some Democrats. I mean, you had Peter Shumlin endorsing John Rogers, who's the Republican nominee for lieutenant governor, against an incumbent Democratic lieutenant governor. So it's a little hard to draw a real lesson from it, except that he won. Other questions? You had one. Uh, 50 years. Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah. Yes, at the back. Yeah, so first I have to think about it too. So I'm going to filibuster here for a minute. What might swing the state to a Democratic governor? It's interesting. I think it goes back to the election this year of the increased Republicans' presence in the state Senate and the state House. Because if that hadn't happened and Phil Hoff had stepped down, I'm sure that we would have elected a Democratic governor this time. And it would have been because there was just a lot of pent up frustration about Phil Scott's vetoes and drawing the line, and we're not making progress, and we haven't solved education financing, and housing is an issue. I will be very curious to see what happens in these next 2 years, this year and next, because this election, and I should have spoken more about this when answering your question. Back after the election, after the creation of civil unions, the Republicans took control of the Vermont House. The Democrats lost it. And that was a change election. That was a big deal. You had Act 60, you had all of these things coming together that forced a change. I think this election was more a message election, not a change election. And the message was about affordability. And the Republicans, Phil Scott put a lot of his capital online. The Republicans had good candidates that they were running, and they had a strong message. When you can focus on a message like Jim equals jobs and hammer it home, it sinks in with people. And I think that was the success that happened this year. But now comes the hard part. They got to make progress. They got to solve this. And you know what? There's a reason it hasn't really been solved. It is incredibly difficult. Education financing, before, when the Brigham decision came down, that said a lot. We needed the Supreme Court of the state to tell us that we had to fix this problem. Our legislature and our governor were incapable of fixing it themselves. They had to have a court order to get them to do it. We don't have that court order. What's going to happen right now? Though I do think that perhaps, there might be some issues that sends this back to the Vermont Supreme Court um, to see whether there's a keeping with Brigham. Education financing, governors have been talking about trying to solve this for more than 100 years. And Madeleine Kunin spent a whole one of her addresses talking about this. So did other governors, because the property tax itself, first of all, education financing is so complicated. I think there are only 6 people in Vermont who can tell us how this system works. 5 of them are in Montpelier. I don't know who that 6th person is, but it is incredibly complicated. Most people don't, when they came out with the new formula after Brigham, they came up with a formula so complicated that no one understands it at all. So there is this income tax circuit breaker that's in there. People are getting tax breaks based on their income. Nobody understands that or appreciates it. So what has to happen this time around, you have to either change the system or you have to find a lot of money to put into the system to lower property taxes. There aren't a lot of ways to do that unless you raise a significant tax like the sales tax, or you go and raise the income tax, which puts Phil Scott on the line because he's against all tax increases. It's not just affordability, the housing crisis, the fact that we have so many unhoused, so many homeless, and that this crisis continues to happen every 6 months. It just shows, the legislature has to fix these problems. It's difficult to do. And so what's really going to make a difference in the next 2 years is how does the legislature and the governor work together and whether they can make progress. And then, I don't know whether Phil Hoff, geez, see, I date myself. Phil Scott runs again or not. I think he probably, hopefully, I think he hopes he doesn't have to run again. I think he hoped that last time too. We have time maybe for one more question? Yes. Yeah, and it's hard with the national divisions as well. I think the greatest thing we have going for us is we are Vermont, and we are a small state, and we have communities and we have neighborhoods. A lot of areas around me flooded both in 2023 July and this last July. And I was struck watching social media and the postings and front porch forums and the like, how everybody put that aside and they came and worked and helped each other with the muck outs and with the fundraising and all of that. I think at a neighbor level, we still have this tremendous advantage that most other Americans don't have. And we're very fortunate to have it. I think we sort of stretched the rubber band on this one with the presidential election, even here in Vermont. There's some areas of Vermont where there are people not talking to each other, even though this was a very strong Democratic state. There are a lot of hard feelings about that. But I do think that we have, the greatest thing we have going is the fact that people will get together at the neighborhood level, at the community store, just at the trash and recycling, whatever it might be, and still have common grounds to discuss things. Randall, I think we're out of time.